Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of the samurai, a world shaped by honor and warfare, poetry and discipline, ritual and rebellion. From the rise of Japan's warrior class to the slow fading of the shogunate, we'll trace the long and complex story of feudal Japan, 1 century at a time. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Whether you're winding down from a busy day or drifting off under a quiet sky, this is your time to settle in, let go, and just listen. This is a story carved across 1,000 years of history, and tonight, it's all yours. In the 9th century, the world of the Japanese court glittered with ceremonial splendor. Kyoto, the imperial capital nestled between mountain ranges, was a city of poets, courtiers, and priests, a place where every gesture and word was weighed with elegance. The aristocracy of the Heian period lived lives suspended in an amber of etiquette and verse. Their days passed in the composition of poetry, the recitation of lineage, the rustling of silk robes along lacquered corridors. The emperor, divine by birth and cloaked in layers of symbolic power, presided over a realm more imagined than governed. Ministers maneuvered beneath him in games of policy and marriage, where paper decrees held more weight than swords. Art and beauty flourished in this age, and the elite turned inward, retreating into their scrolls and gardens, while the world beyond the capital grew darker, hungrier, and more uncertain with each passing season. Tax collectors were beaten or murdered. Rebellions erupted with increasing frequency, often led by dispossessed nobles or hardened frontier clans. The court could neither raise an army nor enforce its commands. What it could do, however, was delegate power to those willing to fight on its behalf. And so it happened that the sword began to speak more clearly than the scroll. It was in this crucible of neglect and necessity that the samurai were born. At first, they were little more than mounted retainers, armed men in the service of provincial landowners, hired to protect estates from thieves or assert land claims against encroaching neighbors. These warriors were not noble in the way the court understood nobility, but they were loyal, fierce, and bound by ties of blood, oath, and obligation. They learned to ride and shoot from childhood, to wield the curved blade, to die for their master if need be. They lived austere lives, far removed from the perfumed intrigues of Kyoto. They trained in the hills and forests, fought in skirmishes no court scribe would ever record, and built reputations not on poetry, but on the clean swiftness of their blades. In time, they would call themselves saburo, those who serve. By the 10th century, the word samurai had begun to take shape not just as a title, but as an identity. Entire clans rose to prominence, defined by their martial prowess and unwavering loyalty to their liege. The Taira and the Minamoto, two sprawling kin groups descended from imperial blood but hardened by provincial life, began carving out territories of influence. Though they still paid lip service to Kyoto, their true power came from the hundreds of warriors who rode at their command, men who would follow them through flood and fire, not because of some distant imperial edict, but because of bonds forged in battle and shared hardship. These clans did not yet seek to overthrow the court, but they were already replacing it in the hearts and minds of the people they ruled. The samurai of these early days were not yet the paragons of refined Bushido idealism they would later become. They were rough, pragmatic, and loyal to those who fed them. Their armor was functional rather than elegant. Their ethics were more about vengeance and clan honor than spiritual clarity. Yet something old and potent stirred within their ranks, a hunger for recognition, for legitimacy, for a place in the great tapestry of history. The court, for all its distance, still represented the sacred center of Japan. And so these warriors, born of dust and blood, began to cast their gaze toward the capital, not as servants, but as contenders. It would take time and blood and betrayal, but already the balance was shifting. The emperor still wore the crown, but far away in the hinterlands, men with swords were beginning to dream of power. The tides of power, once bound to the capital's tranquil palaces, began to roll outward, drawn by ambition and violence into the provinces. The court, gilded and fragile, still issued decrees and appointed governors, but their words no longer reached every corner of the realm. In the eastern reaches of the archipelago, in the broad plains and wooded hills of the Kanto region, men were already defying the old order. Here, where the imperial banners were faded and seldom seen, a warrior named Taira no Masakado dared to do what had once been unthinkable. In the year 939, as the Heian court drifted deeper into ceremonial isolation, Masakado raised the banner of rebellion. He struck not as a petty bandit, nor as a mere usurper, but with a vision that chilled the bones of those who still clung to imperial divinity. He declared himself the new emperor. Masakado, scion of the mighty Taira clan, was no foreign invader. He was a man of noble blood, trained in the sword and the bow, steeped in the martial customs of his ancestors. His rebellion began over land and inheritance, a quarrel with kin that erupted into bloodshed, but it soon took on a larger shape. As he routed rival clans and conquered provincial offices, he styled himself a ruler in his own right. He established courts, collected taxes, and assumed the symbols of imperial authority, mocking the distant throne with each decree. In the eastern provinces, many followed him not out of ideology, but necessity. The court in Kyoto had long since abandoned them. Masakado's rule, however brief, was the only order they had known in a generation of chaos. For a few audacious months, the land bore two emperors, one in the sacred city of Kyoto and one in the untamed east, clad in armor and crowned in steel. The court, slow to stir, reacted with panic. Messengers galloped from shrine to shrine, prayers were offered at every temple, and imperial envoys begged the gods for deliverance. When divine favor proved uncertain, they turned to more practical instruments. The government placed a bounty on Masakado's head, summoning provincial warriors to suppress the traitor. In 940, his rebellion was crushed, his head severed, and brought to the capital as proof that the world still obeyed its ancient center. Yet the illusion was already broken. Masakado's defiance had revealed a terrible truth, that the emperor's reach no longer extended to the edges of the realm, and that a man of sufficient strength and audacity could seize power by the sword alone. His defeat did not stop the rise of the samurai, it hastened it. Others watched and learned. From that moment on, every provincial warlord nursed the knowledge that the court could be defied, that the gods would not always intervene, and that power belonged to those who dared to take it. In the generations that followed, the provincial clans grew bolder. Two families in particular emerged as giants among men. The Taira, who traced their lineage to the imperial line, and whose ships ruled the inland sea, and the Minamoto, descendants of emperors and conquerors, hardened by decades of frontier warfare. These were not mere noble houses. They were vast military machines, forged through centuries of blood feud and martial tradition. Their banners flew over distant provinces, their retainers numbered in the thousands, and their ambitions knew no limit. While the imperial court clung to rituals and poetry, the Taira and Minamoto built fortresses, trained armies, and plotted. Their leaders paid homage to the throne, of course, bowing in ceremony and exchanging gifts with the emperor's ministers, but behind their smiles lay a simmering contempt. They saw what the court refused to admit. That power no longer lay in calligraphy and ceremony, but in cavalry charges and armored ranks. The twilight of the Heian Age was a time of double vision. In Kyoto, one could still believe in the eternal order of things. The court nobles danced beneath lanterns, composed verses about cherry blossoms, and debated the placement of screens in their villas. But beyond the capital's reach, in the forests and river valleys, the old certainties were fading. Samurai lords ruled in all but name, dispensing justice with their own hands, extracting taxes by the blade. The emperor, for all his sacred ancestry, had become a figure of myth to the people of the provinces. His voice was distant, his face unseen, his power abstract. The men who ruled their villages wore iron, not silk. They answered not to Kyoto, but to clan elders and local lords who could ride and fight. The samurai had not yet seized the throne, but they had already seized the country. And so, the pieces fell into place. The Taira and Minamoto, once tools of the court, now prepared to remake the realm in their own image. The old world was fading like mist at dawn, and the new world was being born in fire. Soon, the armies of the samurai would march not only in the name of power, but in the name of empire itself. The storm was coming, and the court would not survive its fury. By the middle of the 12th century, the world of the court teetered on the edge of collapse, though those within its painted walls still pretended otherwise. The emperor's palace in Kyoto remained a symbol of divine rule, but the emperor himself had become a prisoner of tradition, bound by customs too ancient to wield actual authority. Power had seeped away from the throne and pooled in the hands of those who whispered behind screens, men who pulled the levers of government through lineage and marriage. This was a realm not of emperors, but of regents, courtiers, and retired sovereigns who ruled from the shadows. Yet even their grasp was slipping. The court had grown decadent and fractured, obsessed with bloodlines and inheritance disputes, while the provinces boiled with ambition. The samurai, once mere guards to noble houses, now commanded fiefs and armies. And it was through this broken order that a man named Taira no Kiyomori rose like a storm. Kiyomori was not born into greatness. Though his lineage traced back to the imperial line through a distant and sanctioned illegitimacy, he was a provincial warrior by temperament and training. His family had grown powerful in the west, commanding maritime trade routes through the inland sea, and building alliances with regional lords. Unlike the court nobles, who placed faith in poetry and purity, Kiyomori placed his trust in swords and ships. He had spent his youth fighting pirates and skirmishing along the coasts of western Japan, proving himself in battle long before he ever stepped into the capital. When he arrived in Kyoto, he did not come with silken robes or scrolls of verse. He came with an army. The opportunity for ambition to bloom into dominance came in the form of the Hogan Rebellion of 1156. It began, as many such calamities did in those years, with a dispute over succession. The cloistered Emperor Toba had died, and his two sons, Emperor Sutoku and Emperor Go-Shirakawa, each claimed the throne through different lines of legitimacy. Their quarrel was less about vision than about power, and both gathered allies to their cause. The Minamoto clan, powerful but divided, split their loyalty between the brothers. The Taira, more unified and tightly controlled, threw their weight behind Go-Shirakawa. When the streets of Kyoto ran red with blood, it was Kiyomori's cavalry that cut through the enemy ranks. His victory not only secured the emperor's position, but also cemented the Taira as kingmakers. 3 years later, in 1159, a second rebellion shattered what little peace remained. This one, known as the Heiji Rebellion, was born of resentment and envy. Though Kiyomori had supported the emperor and helped him win his throne, the court remained wary of his growing influence. Kiyomori was summoned to Kyoto and fated with honors, but behind the silken veils of the palace, plots brewed. When he departed for a pilgrimage, his enemies struck, led by Fujiwara nobles and a faction of the Minamoto clan under Minamoto no Yoshitomo. The conspirators seized the emperor, slaughtered Kiyomori's allies, and declared a new regime. It might have succeeded had Kiyomori not returned at once with his army. He moved quickly and without mercy, surrounding the capital, routing his enemies, and capturing their leaders. The vengeance that followed was swift and brutal. Yoshitomo was killed. His sons were hunted down. 2 were executed. Only 2 survived. Barely boys, spirited away in secret by loyalists. Kiyomori allowed them to live, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps out of some twisted sense of honor. It was a decision that would shape the future of Japan. With his enemies crushed, Kiyomori stood as the most powerful man in the realm. No other general commanded such loyalty. No noble could rival his wealth. No faction could resist his will. Yet Kiyomori did not merely wish to rule from the shadows as others had done before him. He wanted open power. In 1167, he accepted the highest office in the land short of the throne itself, Daijo Daijin, Grand Minister of State. No samurai had ever held the title. It was a declaration that the age of aristocrats was ending and the age of warriors had begun. Kiyomori's ambitions knew no bounds. He married his daughter Tokuko to the emperor, and when their son was born, that child, Emperor Antoku, became heir to the chrysanthemum throne. Kiyomori now ruled as grandfather to the sovereign, the architect of an unprecedented dynastic merger between blood and blade. But power gained by violence is seldom secure. Kiyomori's enemies multiplied in the shadows. His arrogance alienated the court. His favoritism enraged the provinces. His decision to move the capital to Fukuhara, his home port city near modern-day Kobe, stunned the aristocracy and disrupted the delicate balance of the imperial court. Merchants and coastal lords prospered under his rule, but the old family seethed with indignation. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Minamoto clan, those boys he had spared, were growing into men. They had not forgotten their father's fate, nor the humiliations heaped upon their house. They watched from exile, biding their time, and waited for the moment when vengeance could rise from the ashes. Kiyomori had built an empire of the sword, but he ruled it with pride and fury. His reach extended into every corner of government. His banners flew from castle to coast. He believed himself untouchable, blessed by the gods, and destined to create a new order where the samurai would rule not as servants, but as masters. He had raised his clan from obscurity to dominance, broken his enemies, and shaped the world in his image. Yet in his final years, as sickness gnawed at his flesh and rebellion whispered in the wind, he began to understand what every tyrant eventually learns, that empires made by fire are undone by fire. When Kiyomori died in 1181, he left behind a kingdom trembling on the brink of civil war. The Minamoto had returned, the provinces stirred with unrest, and the boy emperor he had enthroned would soon be fleeing for his life. The dragon had passed, but his shadow remained, and it would take a war to burn it away. When Taira no Kiyomori died in the spring of 1181, the air in the capital thickened with unease. The man who had ruled with such ferocity and arrogance left behind no equal, no successor with the same iron grip over the land and court. His heirs, though proud and numerous, lacked the cunning and terror that had made him master of the realm.
For years, Kiyomori had kept rebellion at bay with threats and bribes, but now the spell was broken. The court whispered of omens, of imbalance in the realm. In the provinces, ambitious men drew swords once hidden, and old grievances stirred like embers in wind. The Minamoto, long thought extinguished, were rising once again, their banners unfurled beneath the wide sky, their vengeance sharpened by years of exile and humiliation.
The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would tear through the heart of Japan like wildfire. It would be called the Genpei War. The Minamoto were led now by Yoritomo, eldest surviving son of the executed Yoshitomo, and the boy once spared by Kiyomori's mercy. He had lived much of his youth in exile, watched over by distant retainers and suspicious governors, his life held in balance by the fragile grace of political indifference. But the blood of warriors flowed in his veins, and when the call to arms reached him in the year 1180, he did not hesitate. A prince of his clan, Prince Mochihito, had declared the Taira illegitimate and called on the Minamoto to rise. Though the prince would be swiftly hunted down and killed by Kiyomori's agents, the call had already echoed across the land. Yoritomo raised his standard at Ishibashiyama, and though his first battle ended in defeat, his defiance ignited a war that would stretch across 5 long and bloody years. The Genpei War was no single battle, no clean campaign fought by noble generals in gleaming armor. It was a slow, grinding conflict of shifting allegiances, ambushes, sea battles, and brutal massacres. Provinces once loyal to the Taira began to drift toward the Minamoto, drawn by promises of reward or sickened by Taira excess. Samurai lords who had once knelt to Kiyomori now weighed the future with colder eyes. In the east, Yoritomo built his power patiently. He established his base in Kamakura, a fortress town surrounded by forests and mountains, far from the corrupting influence of Kyoto. From there, he forged alliances, dispatched envoys, and tightened his grip over the Kanto region. He did not ride recklessly into battle as his ancestors had done. He ruled as a general from a distance, allowing his half-brothers, most notably the brilliant and impetuous Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to carry out his vengeance in the field. The Taira, though still strong, were unprepared for a war of attrition. Their power had always been rooted in the court, in bureaucracies and ritual, in controlling trade routes and tax flows. But war in the mountains and coasts of Japan was a different matter. Their armies, once mighty, now grew thin as provinces defected and local warriors deserted. Their commanders, lacking Kiyomori's ruthless clarity, made mistakes. They overextended, lost control of key roads, and failed to adapt to the fierce and mobile tactics of their enemies. Battles turned against them. At Tsunomata and Kurikara, Minamoto forces routed them with clever traps and sheer ferocity. The Taira lost more than land in those defeats. They lost face, and with it, the fear that had once kept their rivals in line. Among the Minamoto, Yoshitsune emerged as a figure of legend. Young, slender, and brilliant, he led daring raids and nighttime marches through mountain passes, striking the enemy where they least expected. At the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, he led a bold assault down a near-vertical cliffside, catching the Taira off guard and sending them into a rout. His reputation grew with each victory, and his name became a rallying cry for samurai disillusioned with the Taira's decay. Yet his fame also bred suspicion. Yoritomo, ever cautious, watched his younger brother with growing unease. He saw in Yoshitsune not only a hero, but a rival. The final blow came at sea. In the spring of 1185, the Taira gathered their remaining strength at Dan no Ura, a narrow strait in the inland sea. There, surrounded by their fleet and clinging to their young emperor Antoku, grandson of Kiyomori, they prepared for a last stand. The Minamoto fleet, under the command of Yoshitsune, met them in battle. The waters churned with arrows and war cries, ships colliding in bloody confusion. For hours the outcome hung in balance. Then a key Taira commander betrayed his own side, revealing their fleet's formation and turning the tide. As the battle turned against them, the Taira made a final, desperate act. The boy emperor, no more than 6 years old, was wrapped in the arms of his grandmother and taken to the edge of the boat. She whispered prayers, held him close, and leapt into the sea. Many others followed. The sea swallowed them, and with them, the last vestiges of Taira pride. The Minamoto stood triumphant. The Taira clan, once rulers of the realm, had been annihilated. Their heirs were dead, their banners trampled, their bodies floating in the currents of Dan no Ura. The child emperor's death marked more than the end of a dynasty. It signaled the collapse of the old world. The court in Kyoto remained, its ceremonies intact, its titles preserved, but its authority had passed into the hands of warriors. Yoritomo returned not as a rebel, but as a ruler. In 1192, he was formally granted the title of Sei Taishogun by the emperor, a title once bestowed to generals fighting northern barbarians, now revived for a man who had conquered Japan itself. But Yoritomo was no mere general. He was the architect of a new system, one that would root power in the sword and not in the scroll, in fealty and force, rather than in bloodline and ceremony. The Genpei War had ended, but the scars it left upon the land would endure for generations. Entire provinces had been burned, families extinguished, temples desecrated. Yet out of that destruction, something enduring emerged. The age of the samurai had begun in earnest, and with it came a new order, harsh, hierarchical, and born in fire. From the ashes of the Taira, Yoritomo had forged the first shogunate. The court would remain in name, but the sword now ruled the land. The sea still whispered of the fallen Taira when Minamoto no Yoritomo, stern and methodical, laid the foundations of a new world. Where others sought glory on the battlefield or splendor in the palace, Yoritomo envisioned permanence. He had seen too much bloodshed, too much chaos and betrayal, to trust that power could endure without structure. Victory alone was not enough. To hold the realm, he would need to bind it together, not with prayers, nor with banners, but with a new kind of order. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the Genpei War, while the court in Kyoto returned to its old rituals, and while temples rang bells for the dead, Yoritomo began to build the first true samurai government in Japanese history. He did not rule from Kyoto. He ruled from Kamakura. Kamakura was no ancient city. It had no legacy of emperors or shrines, no marble halls or sacred groves. It was a town carved from the forested hills of eastern Japan, closer to the warriors of the countryside than to the courtiers of the capital. That was precisely the point. Yoritomo understood that the court, for all its ceremony and divine authority, was vulnerable to the same intrigues that had once destroyed his father. He would not repeat their mistakes. Far from Kyoto's gilded decay, Kamakura offered distance, defensibility, and freedom from the web of aristocratic manipulation. There, amid pine-covered ridges and mist-shrouded valleys, Yoritomo assembled his circle of generals, advisors, and vassals. It was not the center of the world yet, but it would become the heart of a new regime, one shaped not by imperial decree, but by the iron code of the sword. Yoritomo's vision was not just military, it was systemic. He formalized the network of power that had grown organically during the war. Instead of attempting to govern the provinces directly from a central palace, he appointed loyal samurai to serve as shugo, or military governors, responsible for maintaining order and defense in the provinces. Beneath them were jito, estate stewards tasked with tax collection, land management, and enforcing the shogunate's rule on a more local scale. These men were not drawn from the old nobility. They were hardened warriors, many of them veterans of the Genpei War, bound to Yoritomo by ties of blood and gratitude. In return for their loyalty, they were granted authority over land and people. This new feudal structure did not destroy the old aristocracy. It bypassed it, creating a parallel chain of command that answered to Kamakura, not Kyoto. The implications were profound. For the first time, Japan had two centers of power, the emperor's court in the west and the shogun's camp in the east. On paper, the emperor remained supreme. His name adorned the laws. His line remained unbroken. But in truth, he had become a figurehead. The real decisions were made in Kamakura, where armored men plotted the movement of troops, debated the fate of provinces, and issued orders enforced by steel. This was the true revolution of Yoritomo, not the seizure of the throne, but the creation of a government that rendered the throne irrelevant. He called it the Bakufu, or tent government, a name that evoked the mobile command posts of warriors on campaign. But this tent was made of stone, and it would stand for generations. To ensure his power could not be undone by the same forces that had once destroyed the Taira, Yoritomo instituted a series of laws that codified his supremacy. He received official sanction from the emperor in 1192, who named him Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo. It was a title rooted in old campaigns against the Ainu in the north, but in Yoritomo's hands it became something far greater, a symbol of ultimate military authority. He forbade imperial officials from making appointments without his approval. He claimed the right to judge disputes among his vassals. He even created a legal code, the Goseibai Shikimoku, which outlined the rights and duties of samurai, codified land inheritance, and established Kamakura as the final court of appeal. For a society long ruled by aristocratic whim, this was a shock. For the samurai, it was liberation. But Yoritomo's rule was not without shadows. Though he had survived the war, he had not emerged untouched by its cruelty. He grew suspicious, even paranoid, of threats to his authority. His own brothers, including the brilliant Yoshitsune, who had won so many victories against the Taira, became victims of his fear. Yoshitsune's fame, his beauty, and his tragic charm made him beloved among the people and dangerous in the eyes of the shogun. Accused of treason, he was hunted across the country like an animal, betrayed by former allies, and finally cornered in the northern provinces, where he took his own life rather than fall into his brother's hands. Yoritomo wept no tears. Power had demanded sacrifice, and he gave it without flinching. When he died in 1199, Yoritomo left behind a government more stable than any Japan had seen in 100 years. The shogunate he created would endure through blood and upheaval, rising and falling like the tide, but always retaining the central premise he had forged, that warriors, not courtiers, would rule the land. The emperor still sat on his throne, enshrined in tradition and draped in divine right, but his voice was now faint beneath the clangor of armor. The court still danced and composed its verses, but the men who truly governed Japan now wore swords at their waist and swore loyalty not to heaven, but to the law of the shogun. Thus began the age of feudal Japan, not as a moment of conquest, but as a reordering of the world. Yoritomo's revolution was quiet, methodical, and merciless. He did not seek glory, he sought control, and in the hills of Kamakura, behind walls of stone and ranks of loyal men, he found it. When Yoritomo died in the early months of 1199, his death sent tremors through the fragile edifice he had so carefully constructed. There had been no thunder, no assassination, no battlefield glory to mark the passing of the first shogun. He fell from his horse on a winter ride, and with that sudden and unceremonious end, the man who had turned warriors into rulers vanished into the earth. But the machine he had built did not crumble. It endured because its gears were already turning in the hands of another family, one that had long stood in his shadow, watching and waiting. The Hojo clan, guardians and in-laws to Yoritomo, now stepped forward to seize what he had left behind, not through war, not through proclamations, but through quiet cunning and the slow tightening of invisible chains. Hojo Tokimasa, father of Yoritomo's wife Masako, was the first to move. An old man with a stern face and unyielding ambition, he understood that the future lay not in claiming titles, but in controlling those who held them. Yoritomo's eldest son, Yorie, succeeded him as shogun, but he was still young and unseasoned, driven more by personal emotion than political foresight. Tokimasa surrounded the boy with advisors loyal to the Hojo, isolating him from allies and whispering poison in his ear. It was not long before father and son stood at odds. The court watched with unease, but Tokimasa was unbothered. When Yorie began plotting with rivals to assert his independence, Tokimasa acted. In the year 1203, the young shogun was placed under house arrest, forced to abdicate, and eventually murdered. His younger brother, Sanetomo, a boy barely out of childhood, was made the new shogun. With one hand on the hilt and the other on the cradle, the Hojo had taken power. Yet it was not Tokimasa who would prove the architect of the regency. It was his daughter, Hojo Masako, widow of Yoritomo, remembered by history as the nun shogun. After her husband's death, Masako had taken vows as a Buddhist nun, a gesture that veiled her intentions in piety and submission. But beneath the robes, she remained every bit her father's daughter, clever, iron-willed, and unafraid. From within the cloister, she maneuvered through the halls of power with a steadiness that belied her religious garb. When her father grew too bold and sought to dominate the court entirely, she turned on him. She conspired with her brother, Hojo Yoshitoki, and together they forced Tokimasa into retirement, stripping him of power and sending him into monastic exile. Blood had not yet stained the walls, but the Hojo had learned the ways of control from Yoritomo well. The title of shogun would remain with the Minamoto line for a time longer, but it was now the Hojo regents, the Shikin, who wielded the blade behind the curtain. The Minamoto bloodline dwindled and soon vanished, replaced by figureheads drawn from other noble houses, or even imperial cadet branches. These men sat on thrones, bore swords, and held no real authority. The Hojo ruled with soft voices and firm laws, reshaping the Bakufu into something that could outlast any one man. But even the most well-built fortress cannot remain untouched by ambition. In the year 1221, the imperial court made its final attempt to claw back power from the warrior class. Emperor Go-Toba, a cloistered sovereign who had once accepted the samurai's dominance with bitter grace, raised the banner of rebellion in Kyoto. In what came to be known as the Jokyu War, he summoned loyalists to arms, hoping to rally the old aristocracy, Buddhist monasteries, and provincial governors against the Kamakura regime. His letters were grand, laced with the rhetoric of divine right and sacred restoration. But his plan was rooted in fantasy. The days when the court could raise armies with a wave of the hand were gone. The samurai lords no longer feared the throne. They answered to Kamakura, and Kamakura answered to the Hojo. The response was swift and ruthless. Hojo Yoshitoki, then regent, dispatched a massive force to the west. The shogunate's army marched into Kyoto with grim precision, crushing the imperial loyalists in a matter of days. Emperor Go-Toba was captured and sent into exile on a distant island, where he would spend the remainder of his life composing poetry and mourning the end of an age. The court was brought to heel, its military authority broken, its ambitions shattered, and in the wake of that victory, the Hojo established a permanent military office in Kyoto, the Rokuhara Tandai, to oversee the capital and ensure that no emperor would again dare to dream of sovereignty. The samurai had not only won the war, they had institutionalized their victory. There would be no more illusions. With their position secure, the Hojo set about codifying law and reinforcing the shogunate's authority. They maintained a council of elders to handle disputes among samurai and issued legal decisions that emphasized stability over honor. The warrior class, once a loose brotherhood of armed retainers, now found itself bound by rules, protocols, and land inheritance systems designed to preserve peace. The court still performed its rituals. The emperor still conducted seasonal rites, but none of it mattered anymore. The sword had replaced the scepter, and the true court was in Kamakura, where the Shikin ruled behind closed doors. Yet peace is never permanent in a land born of war. The Hojo would rule for over a century, but their story, like that of the Taira and the Minamoto before them, was not eternal. For now, they held the keys to power, cloaked in religious piety and administrative control, guiding Japan through an uneasy calm. They had tamed the provinces and shackled the emperor. But beyond the seas, the winds of the steppe were stirring, and a storm was coming, one born not of internal ambition, but of an empire unlike any Japan had ever faced. The 13th century dawned over Japan beneath a sky that seemed, for a time, still and clear. The Hojo Regency presided over a realm that had known generations of war, only to settle into an uneasy, disciplined peace. The Bakufu in Kamakura enforced law through stern governance and a carefully balanced network of samurai vassals. The imperial court remained a ceremonial echo of a bygone era, watched always by the shogunate's stewards in Kyoto. Trade flowed. Roads were patrolled. The fields yielded their rice. Japan, for the first time in living memory, seemed ruled not by chaos, but by a system, strict, austere, and deeply entrenched in the order of warrior rule. Yet far beyond the shores of Kyushu, beyond the southern trade winds and the ports of China and Goryeo, a shadow was growing. It moved not with subtlety or whispers, but with the sound of hooves like thunder and banners that blackened the sky. The Mongol Empire, born from the ashes of the steppe and forged by the will of Genghis Khan, was coming. And though the seas separated Japan from the continent, the gods would not hold the tide forever. It began with letters. The new Mongol emperor, Kublai Khan, grandson of the great conqueror and founder of the Yuan dynasty in China, sent envoys to Japan in the year 1268. The messages were written with the imperious tone of a sovereign who had never tasted defeat. Kublai addressed the shogunate as if it were a vassal court, warning that the wise would submit peacefully and that resistance would bring ruin. He made no reference to the emperor in Kyoto, addressing his letters directly to the authorities in Kamakura, a calculated insult that spoke volumes. The Hojo regents, however, were unimpressed. To acknowledge the Mongol letter would be to legitimize its claims. To respond with threats would risk a war they were not yet prepared to fight. And so, they chose silence. Silence was not something the Mongols tolerated for long. In the year 1274, Kublai Khan launched his first invasion. From the ports of Korea, which had already fallen under his control, he sent an armada of some 900 ships carrying more than 20,000 men. These were no mere raiders. The army was a fearsome mixture of Mongol cavalry, Chinese conscripts, and Korean auxiliaries, armed with iron bows, catapults, and a weapon the Japanese had never seen before: black powder bombs that screamed through the air and exploded in showers of flame and shrapnel. They landed at Tsushima, slaughtered its defenders, and pushed forward to Iki Island, then finally reached the coast of Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. What followed was chaos. The samurai, brave and skilled in their art, were unprepared for the style of war the Mongols brought with them. In the Japanese tradition, battles were often governed by ritual and individual valor. Samurai would announce themselves, challenge opponents in single combat, and fight for personal honor. The Mongols had no interest in such ceremony. They advanced in coordinated ranks, unleashed volleys of arrows that darkened the skies, and pressed forward with relentless speed. They used drums to control the battlefield, synchronized movements to confuse and encircle, and tactics refined across the steppes of Asia. The Japanese defenders, though valiant, were overwhelmed. Panic gripped the defenders of Hakata. The Mongols established a beachhead and prepared for conquest. And then the storm came. It was sudden and ferocious, as if summoned by the old gods of the islands. A typhoon rose out of the sea with a howl that silenced war drums and shattered masts. The Mongol fleet, still anchored in the bay, was caught helplessly in its wrath. Ships capsized, soldiers drowned. Fire vessels, once engines of war, became torches upon the waves. The survivors fled in disarray, their invasion broken not by sword or arrow, but by wind and water. Japan exhaled. The shogunate called it divine intervention. The term kamikaze, the divine wind, was born in reverent tones. It became legend, a word that would echo through future centuries. But those in Kamakura, wiser than the poets, knew better than to believe the threat had ended. In the wake of the invasion, the shogunate moved swiftly to prepare. Defense lines were reinforced along Kyushu's vulnerable shores. Massive stone walls were constructed at Hakata Bay, stretching for miles to repel future landings. Samurai from across the provinces were rotated through defensive duty, garrisoning fortifications and drilling for the day the enemy would return. Yet this defensive labor came at a cost. The first Mongol invasion had been repelled by a storm, not by victory in battle, and there had been no plunder to distribute among the defenders. The samurai who had fought received little or nothing for their service. In the samurai code, loyalty was tied to reward, and reward was tied to conquest. Now they served without compensation, watching the horizon for a fleet that might never come. Discontent began to simmer beneath the surface. But the Mongols were not finished. In 1281, Kublai Khan launched a second, even greater invasion. This time, it was not a show of force, but a full-scale war of conquest. 2 fleets were raised, one from China, another from Korea, bringing together over 4,000 ships and nearly 140,000 men. It was one of the largest seaborne invasions in world history. For weeks they assembled across the sea, an armada of such staggering size that it blotted out the coastlines and made the ocean itself a weapon. When they came ashore, the battle began anew. The stone walls at Hakata held, and the defenders fought with greater resolve. Samurai launched nightly raids against Mongol camps, striking with speed and fury. But the enemy was vast. The struggle was desperate. And then, once more, the wind rose. A second typhoon descended upon the Mongol fleet as they clustered offshore. This storm was even greater than the first. For days, waves pounded the ships. Anchors snapped. Hulls split apart on rocks. Men were swept into the sea by the thousands. The surviving ships drifted into Japanese hands, their crews slaughtered or captured. The invasion force was annihilated. The coasts of Kyushu were littered with broken hulls and the dead. The sea, again, had become Japan's shield. The divine wind had returned, and its legend deepened. Yet even as the people gave thanks to the gods, those in Kamakura looked to the future with dread. Victory had come at a terrible price. The Bakufu had emptied its coffers to prepare for war, and there had been no spoils to recoup the cost. The samurai, who had sacrificed for the nation, were left unpaid, their loyalty strained. Many had expected new estates, titles, or treasure. Instead, they returned home weary, hungry, and restless. The prestige of the shogunate remained intact for the moment, but its foundation had begun to erode. The war had preserved Japan's independence, but it had revealed cracks in the system that no wind could mend. The Mongols would not return, but the consequences of their coming would ripple through the decades to come. The divine wind had saved the realm. It had not saved the regime. In the years ahead, it would not be foreign invaders that threatened the Bakufu, but the very warriors who had once sworn to defend it. The winds had scattered the Mongol fleets and buried their ambitions beneath the waves. But the storm that followed came not from foreign shores. It brewed within Japan itself, in the hearts of those who had bled for a country that had forgotten them. The years that followed the invasions were not years of peace, but of silence. And in silence, resentment festered. The Hojo regents, secure in their stronghold at Kamakura, mistook the hush for harmony, mistook loyalty for obedience. They believed the divine wind had confirmed their legitimacy. They believed the gods had anointed them. But the truth was far simpler. They had weathered the storm, and now they faced the tide. The Mongol invasions had left the realm intact, but the economy in tatters. The Bakufu had summoned thousands of warriors to defend the shores, had poured coin into fortifications and fleets, had stretched the nation's resources to the brink. In a society where service was always compensated, where the bond between lord and vassal was measured in land and favor, the absence of reward was a slow poison. The samurai who had ridden to war returned to find no lands granted, no gold given, no honors bestowed. Their sacrifices had preserved the country, but there was no conquest, no spoils, no inheritance to pass to their sons. They returned to debts, to dwindling estates, to the slow erosion of dignity. The Hojo offered thanks and sermons. The samurai had wanted something more tangible. At the heart of the unrest was the contradiction that had long lain at the center of the Kamakura system. The shogunate claimed to rule in the name of the emperor, but in practice it ruled without him. The emperor performed rituals. The shogunate held power. Yet with each passing decade, as the Hojo regents consolidated control and the figurehead shoguns became increasingly ceremonial, even the illusion of imperial relevance began to stir indignation. Among the aristocracy in Kyoto, a slow-burning fury gathered. Among the disillusioned warriors, that fury found expression. What had once been a compromise, emperor in name, warrior in deed, was now a fracture, one that would soon become a wound. The man who tore it open was Emperor Go-Daigo. He was not a great general. He had never drawn a blade in anger, but Go-Daigo was no puppet. Born in 1288, he came to the throne in an era when emperors were expected to reign without ruling, to recite prayers and tend to rituals while real power was wielded elsewhere. But Go-Daigo was different. He had read the classics. He had studied the chronicles of the Chinese emperors who had thrown off their regents and taken the mandate of heaven into their own hands. He believed that the emperor should not serve. He believed the throne was not a symbol, but a sword. And so, in secret, he began to plan. His first attempt to seize power in 1331 was premature. The Hojo, though weakened, still possessed formidable intelligence and reach. When word of the plot spread, Kamakura responded with speed. The emperor was deposed and exiled to the Oki Islands, a remote archipelago far from the courtly salons of Kyoto. There, surrounded by sea and wind, Go-Daigo bided his time. And while he was gone, the realm stirred. The Hojo sent a replacement emperor to the throne, a puppet in silks. But the warriors of the provinces, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kamakura's rigid rule, began to ask whether the old order still served their needs. Among those warriors, a few would rise to reshape history. The first was Kusunoki Masashige, a minor landholder from Kawachi province. Fiercely loyal to Go-Daigo, he was a master of strategy and irregular warfare. His forces were small but disciplined, and he knew how to make terrain and tactics serve his ends. At the fortress of Chihaya, he held out against overwhelming numbers, repelling Hojo forces again and again. His resistance became legend. He fought not for land, not for profit, but for a vision of the emperor restored, of the realm returned to divine rule. His banners flew in the name of righteousness, and his name became a whisper of hope across the provinces. But the final blow to the Hojo came from within their own system. Minamoto no Yoritomo's shogunate had survived, not because it was loved, but because it had been obeyed. That obedience was breaking. Among the generals sent by Kamakura to suppress the uprisings was a man named Ashikaga Takauji. He was of the Minamoto line, though several generations removed, and had risen through the ranks as a loyal servant of the Bakufu. But he was ambitious, and he saw in the chaos a chance to carve out a future not tied to the crumbling dynasty of the Hojo. In 1333, instead of suppressing the rebellion, Takauji turned on his masters. He marched into Kyoto, drove out the puppet emperor, and welcomed Go-Daigo back to the throne. That same year, another army led by Nitta Yoshisada advanced on Kamakura itself. The Hojo raised what defenses they could, but their time had passed. The city was encircled, then stormed. Fires raged through its streets. Temples, once serene, burned with screams and the clash of steel. As the gates fell and the Hojo lines collapsed, the final members of the ruling clan gathered at their ancestral temple and performed ritual suicide. It was not a battle, it was a funeral. The Kamakura shogunate, which had ruled for nearly 150 years, was gone. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Go-Daigo's dream had come true. He returned to Kyoto in triumph, not as a priest-king, but as a sovereign in truth. He declared the end of warrior rule. He restored direct imperial government, an era he named the Kenmu Restoration. He dressed his court in the colors of ancient days and declared that the age of the shogun had ended. But the world he returned to was not the world his ancestors had ruled. The samurai had tasted power, and they would not return quietly to their plows. They had governed provinces, judged lawsuits, led armies. They had fought and died for rulers who respected their swords, not their bloodlines. They were not ready to bow to a scholar in brocade robes who spoke of mandate and divinity. And Takauji, the very man who had made Go-Daigo's restoration possible, now saw that his place in this new order was little better than servitude. Disillusionment turned to defiance. Takauji broke with the court and raised an army of his own. In 1336, he marched on Kyoto once more, this time not as a liberator, but as a conqueror. Go-Daigo fled, carrying with him the imperial regalia, the sword, the mirror, and the jewel, and established a rival court in the southern mountains. But Takauji placed another emperor on the throne in Kyoto, one more amenable to warrior rule. The land was split in two. For more than half a century, two imperial lines would claim legitimacy. The country entered a period of civil division, of dual courts and fractured loyalties. It was not peace, it was not unity, but for Takauji, it was enough. The fall of Kamakura did not mark the end of samurai rule. It marked its transformation. The old order had been built on a vision of service, of warriors beneath a sacred crown. That vision had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. In its place rose a new ideal, harsher and more pragmatic. The sword was no longer a servant of the throne. it had become the throne itself. And the man who now wore the mantle of power was not a descendant of Yoritomo, nor a son of the Hojo, but Ashikaga Takauji, shogun in all but name, herald of a new age, and founder of the dynasty that would bear his name. The fire that had devoured Kamakura left not the light of unity, but the smoke of division. Japan, for all its islands and coastlines, was now a fractured body, its limbs loyal to different masters, its heart split in two. The old shogunate was ashes, the Hojo line extinguished, and the sacred court in Kyoto had, for the first time in generations, reclaimed authority over the land. But what had risen in its place was not peace, nor the serene harmony that Emperor Go-Daigo had promised with his restoration. It was ambition, born of chaos. It was the ambition of warriors who had seen the fragility of crowns and realized that power could be seized not with prayer, but with steel. And no man understood that truth better than Ashikaga Takauji. He was a man of contradictions, a general by upbringing, a descendant of the Minamoto line by blood. Takauji had fought on behalf of the shogunate during the Mongol invasions, then turned his sword against the Hojo to restore the emperor. For that loyalty, Go-Daigo had rewarded him with commands and titles, treating him as a trusted servant. But Takauji had no wish to be a servant. He had toppled a dynasty. He had led men through fire. And now, in the first years of the so-called Kenmu Restoration, he found himself pushed aside, his opinions dismissed, his warriors unrewarded, while the imperial court reasserted old hierarchies and renewed its disdain for the class that had saved it from ruin. The emperor surrounded himself with court nobles and scholars. He reopened old rituals and spoke of a divine age, as if the last 150 years of warrior rule had been a bad dream that could be wiped away with a decree. To the samurai of the provinces, it was a betrayal. They had fought and bled under Takauji's banners, not for incense and silk, but for land, authority, and recognition. Now they were dismissed, their claims rejected by the very court they had reinstated. In Kyushu, in the Kanto, in the mountains of Shinano, samurai began to whisper. They spoke of broken promises, of the arrogance of Kyoto, of a court that understood calligraphy but not loyalty. Their eyes turned back to Takauji, and Takauji, bitter and calculating, listened. In the year 1335, the unrest boiled over. Go-Daigo's restoration was barely 2 years old when the first signs of rebellion emerged. Takauji, under the pretext of suppressing a local uprising, mobilized his army and marched east. But instead of returning to Kyoto in triumph, he turned his back on the emperor. He claimed that the court had lost the mandate of heaven, that its authority was illegitimate, and that Japan needed a ruler who could balance strength with justice. He installed a rival emperor, a scion of the imperial line more amenable to his ambitions, and declared himself the protector of this northern court. In doing so, he split the sacred throne in two. There was now a southern court in Yoshino, led by Go-Daigo and his loyalists, and a northern court in Kyoto, backed by Takauji and his army. The land was torn down the spine. This era, known to history as the period of the northern and southern courts, was not a single war, but a long unraveling, a generation of battles, assassinations, and shifting loyalties. It was a time when provinces swore allegiance to one emperor in the spring and to another by autumn. It was a time when brothers fought on opposite sides, when monks donned armor, and when temples became fortresses. The two emperors, both of imperial blood, claimed to speak for the gods, but it was the samurai who decided whose banners flew from the castles and watchtowers of Japan. For nearly 60 years, the realm remained divided, and in that division, Takauji and his descendants cemented their rule. In 1338, Takauji was granted the title of Sei Taishogun by the Northern Court. With that appointment, the Ashikaga shogunate was born, not with the thunder of conquest, but with the quiet ink of ritual authority, the same authority he had once defied. He established his government in Kyoto's Muromachi district, close enough to the court to manage it, far enough to manipulate it. The Muromachi Bakufu, unlike Kamakura's distant bastion, was entwined with the imperial capital. It was not a fortress, it was a web, but Takauji's shogunate was weaker at its core than Yoritomo's had been. The Kamakura Bakufu had maintained order through a strict hierarchy, enforced by Shugo and Jito, who owed their position to a centralized authority. Takauji, by contrast, had risen on the backs of allies, powerful provincial lords who demanded autonomy in return for their support. He could not deny them. He did not attempt to. The Ashikaga regime was less a pyramid than a loose federation of strongmen, each lord ruling his domain as a miniature kingdom. Loyalty was transactional. Justice was negotiable. In the absence of a dominant hand, old rivalries reawakened, new ones were born, and the seeds of future disaster were sown. Even within his own family, Takauji's grip faltered. His younger brother Tadayoshi had long been his closest advisor, the man who tempered Takauji's ambition with prudence. But as the years passed, their visions diverged. Tadayoshi saw the shogunate as a chance to build a fair and stable order. Takauji saw it as a weapon for survival. Their feud became public, then deadly. In the 1350s, a bitter civil conflict erupted between the brothers, known as the Kano disturbance. For several years, the Bakufu was paralyzed by their struggle. Tadayoshi was poisoned. Takauji died shortly after in 1358, exhausted and worn from decades of war and intrigue. He had built a dynasty, but not a foundation. Yet his legacy endured. His son, Ashikaga Yoshiakira, and his grandson, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, would continue to rule as shoguns. The Ashikaga would preside over a government that blended the pageantry of the court with the brutality of the battlefield. They would sponsor Zen temples, commission gilded pavilions, and host grand embassies. Even as warlords fought over river valleys and rice fields, they would inherit a fractured realm and declare it whole. They would wear robes and armor, speak of harmony, and prepare for war. And always, in the shadows, the two emperors remained, each claiming legitimacy, each calling for loyalty, each a symbol of a nation that had forgotten how to be one. Takauji's coup had reshaped Japan, not by abolishing the throne, but by dividing it. He did not end the imperial line, he made it a battlefield. And in doing so, he inaugurated an age where legitimacy was a matter of strength, where the sword became the quill, and where Japan, for all its rituals and heritage, entered a new chapter, one of splendor, corruption, rebellion, and soon enough, fire. For a time, it seemed as though the Ashikaga shogunate might succeed where its predecessors had failed. The court had been subdued, the warriors pacified, the throne stabilized, if only by division. Under Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun and grandson of Takauji, the Muromachi Bakufu reached its zenith. He He brought a tenuous end to the war between the northern and southern courts in 1392, convincing the southern emperor to abdicate and reunifying the imperial line, though true power remained in his own hands. He ruled not only with sword and decree, but with spectacle and wealth. He constructed the magnificent Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, a temple as much a monument to his worldly dominance as it was to Zen philosophy. He opened relations with Ming China, became a broker of international trade, and filled Kyoto with treasures brought by foreign ships. His rule brought rare stability, a golden mask concealing the cracks beneath. But gold peels in time. The strength of the Ashikaga shogunate was an illusion born of one man's charisma, wealth, and shrewd alliances. Beneath the surface, the very structure of the Bakufu was coming undone. Unlike Kamakura, which had built its rule on tight military command and clear chains of loyalty, Muromachi governance relied on cooperation among powerful regional lords. These lords, the daimyo, were not salaried administrators. They were landholders and warlords in their own right, their power rooted in the strength of their armies and the loyalty of their retainers. They had bled to put the Ashikaga in power, and they expected autonomy in return. Over time, they came to act not as vassals but as kings. They collected their own taxes, passed their own laws, and waged private wars under the polite fiction of obedience. The shogun could issue commands, but whether those commands were obeyed depended on the temperament and ambition of each lord. This centrifugal drift accelerated under Yoshimitsu's successors. His son, Yoshimochi, lacked the vision to maintain unity. His grandson, Yoshinori, ruled with such brutality that he was assassinated in his own palace by a disaffected vassal. The next shoguns were chosen not for their strength, but for their pliability. Some were appointed as children, others were figureheads controlled by courtiers and regents. The Ashikaga Bakufu, once the keystone of order, became a court of whispering factions and paper decrees, unable to assert its will over the provinces. In the absence of central authority, old rivalries returned with vengeance. Domains that had been kept in check now erupted in feuds. The daimyo, once held together by the prestige of the shogun, began to see one another as threats, and their ambitions as justifications for war. The final spark came in the form of a succession crisis. In 1464, the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, a man more interested in the aesthetics of garden design and incense contests than in governance, faced the dilemma of succession. Childless and disinterested, he had named his brother Yoshimi as heir. But when his wife gave birth to a son, she insisted that the infant be named successor instead. What might have remained a courtly squabble escalated rapidly as powerful daimyo aligned themselves behind the rival claims. On one side stood Hosokawa Katsumoto, a seasoned warrior and the official kanrei, or deputy shogun, who supported Yoshimi. On the other side stood Yamana Sozen, his bitter rival and father-in-law, backing the child. Their quarrel was more than personal. It was political, it was generational, and it would consume Kyoto in fire. In 1467, war broke out. What began as a dispute between two lords escalated into the most devastating conflict Japan had seen in centuries. Armies marched into the capital, bringing tens of thousands of soldiers. The imperial court, caught in the middle, became a pawn in a game it no longer understood. Temples became fortresses. Monasteries became command posts. Palaces were fortified, then burned. The city became a battlefield. The war lasted 10 years, known as the Onin War, and by the time it ended, there was no victor, only ruin. The fighting in Kyoto was brutal and indiscriminate. Entire districts were reduced to ash. Aristocratic families fled, never to return. The city, once the heart of Imperial Japan, became a ghost of its former self, choked in smoke and haunted by starving survivors. The shogunate, which had presided over the war but failed to prevent or contain it, emerged shattered. Yoshimasa, the shogun who had lit the fire with his indecision, retired to his silver pavilion and withdrew from public life. The authority of the Ashikaga regime, already tenuous, crumbled completely. Across the land, daimyo ceased to recognize the central government's legitimacy. In the absence of command, the country fragmented. When the ashes settled in 1477, Japan was no longer a single kingdom in practice. It had become a mosaic of semi-independent domains, each ruled by its own warlord, each pursuing its own ambition. The concept of central rule became a memory. The emperor still sat on his throne, surrounded by empty courtiers and faded rituals. The shogun still bore the title, but it was a hollow one, unsupported by armies or fear. The real power belonged now to those who could hold their land with swords and alliances. Men of low birth rose through the ranks to become lords. Old houses fell to their retainers. Cities built walls and hired mercenaries. The age of feudal order had collapsed into an age of civil anarchy. The Onin War had no decisive winner, but it left a clear legacy. It shattered the last illusions of national unity. It marked the death of aristocratic dominance and the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one waged not between great clans for honor and courtly favor, but between rival warlords for survival. Japan entered the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, where the rules were rewritten, and the future belonged not to noble lineage, but to those who could claim it by force. The Ashikaga remained in Kyoto, presiding over the rubble like ghosts of a forgotten age. But the world had moved on. The provinces belonged to the sword now. And though it would take a century of blood to forge unity again, the forge had already been lit. When the smoke of the Onin War finally cleared from the ruined corridors of Kyoto, it revealed not the outlines of a restored nation, but a broken archipelago of ambition. Japan, once tethered by a fragile thread of imperial ritual and shogunal command, had come undone. The Ashikaga Bakufu, though still seated in the charred shell of the capital, now ruled in name alone. The emperor, too, remained in his palace, but his voice had grown so faint it scarcely echoed beyond the walls of his garden court. Into this void stepped the daimyo, the provincial lords who had once answered to shogun and sovereign alike, and who now turned their swords toward one another. The land became a chessboard without a king. The age of unity was over. This was the Sengoku Jidai, the warring states period, a century of chaos in which power no longer belonged to titles, but to those who could seize and hold it by force. The daimyo were many, and their ambitions boundless. No longer tethered by fear of the capital or by the ceremonial chains of courtly obligation, they acted with impunity, carving up the country into fiefdoms governed like independent kingdoms. They built walls around their towns, stockpiled rice and weapons, and swore no allegiance to Kyoto unless it suited them. Some held vast provinces, inherited through ancient bloodlines and reinforced by military strength. Others had risen through cunning and ruthlessness, men of no distinguished heritage who had taken what they needed with fire and steel. In this new Japan, birth mattered less than might, and loyalty was a currency spent and lost by the season. To maintain their power, the daimyo relied not only on the traditional samurai class, but increasingly on large numbers of foot soldiers, ashigaru, drawn from the peasantry and trained to fight in formation. Where battles had once been decided by individual valor, now they were determined by formations of hundreds or thousands, coordinated in disciplined waves. Fortresses sprouted across the countryside, constructed on mountaintops and river bends, designed to resist siege and protect precious food stores. Towns grew around them, bustling with armorers, merchants, spies, and priests. The castle town became the nucleus of warlord society, a center of politics, economy, and command. Each of these miniature capitals pulsed with ambition, with rumor, and with fear. Nowhere was this new order more visible than in the rivalries that emerged across the provinces. In the central plains of Kai, Takeda Shingen rose as a general of incomparable discipline and strategy. His forces moved with speed, his logistics were unmatched, and his banners bore the phrase, "Swift as the wind, silent as a forest, fierce as fire, immovable as a mountain." To the north, Uesugi Kenshin, the dragon of Echigo, matched him blow for blow. Their clashes, especially the legendary battles of Kawanakajima, were not mere contests of arms, but of will and vision. Though they respected one another, they could not coexist. Each man ruled his domain with absolute authority. Each dreamed of extending that rule beyond the mountains that hemmed him in. But these were only two among dozens. In the west, the Mori clan expanded its naval power, controlling trade routes and coastal strongholds. In the east, the Hojo of Odawara consolidated power through marriage, construction, and methodical diplomacy. In the south, the Shimazu of Satsuma clashed with rivals across Kyushu. Across every province, retainers turned on their masters, sons usurped fathers, and former peasants seized the banners of fallen lords. A new term emerged during this time, Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high. It was not just a word, it was a truth. In this age, power did not descend, it rose. And yet, for all its violence, the Sengoku period was not merely a time of ruin. In the crucible of anarchy, new systems began to form. Many warlords, in their hunger for stability, enacted reforms that centralized governance and made their domains more efficient than anything Kyoto had ever produced. They codified laws, regulated trade, and developed taxation systems that rewarded loyalty and punished idleness. Some even promoted agriculture and protected religious institutions, not out of piety, but because they understood that prosperity fed armies. Ironically, in the absence of national unity, local governance grew sharper. The daimyo were not idle tyrants. They were architects of power. They understood that wealth could build walls, and walls could outlast battles. Culture, too, refused to wither in the chaos. The samurai continued to refine their arts. Poetry, calligraphy, and tea ceremony were practiced within the walls of castles, even as war raged beyond them. Zen Buddhism flourished, offering solace to warriors who knew they might not survive the next campaign. Philosophy and brutality walked hand in hand. A sword hung at every hip, but incense still curled through the rafters. The paradox of Sengoku Japan was that it birthed both savagery and sophistication, often in the same room, often in the same man. But for all the pageantry, for all the lords who dressed in brocade and quoted Confucius, the truth of the time was written in steel. The country was without a master. The emperor was a ghost, the shogun a shadow, and the land had no center. Each castle town, each daimyo, each warband marched not in service of a common cause, but in the pursuit of personal destiny. It was a time when ambition was law and betrayal was currency. A time when even the mightiest dared not close both eyes in sleep. No family was safe, no alliance permanent, and through the blood and smoke, all waited for one who might rise, not just as a lord of one province, but as a unifier of all. That man had not yet appeared, but the roads were clearing, the swords were sharpening, and the dream of unity, buried under decades of war, had not yet died. It waited, as all things do in Japan, in silence. The world beyond Japan was changing, and though the seas had long protected the archipelago from the tides of empire and doctrine, the winds of the 16th century carried with them strange ships, stranger weapons, and stranger gods. Even as daimyo battled one another in endless skirmishes for rice fields and river crossings, even as castles were razed and razed and razed again, the shores of Tanegashima Island bore witness to something entirely new. In the year 1543, a Chinese junk carrying several Portuguese merchants was blown off course during a monsoon and drifted toward the southern coast of Japan. The islanders who greeted it did not yet know they were witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would alter the very fabric of samurai warfare, society, and faith. For the Portuguese brought with them not only steel and silk, but the arquebus, a crude but deadly matchlock firearm that spat thunder and death across the field without regard for swordsmanship or lineage. At first, the weapon was an oddity, a curiosity to be examined and perhaps dismissed. But in an age where the balance of power hung on inches and seconds, where the difference between defeat and dominion could be a single charge or a failed ambush, no advantage went ignored for long. The Lord of Tanegashima Island ordered his blacksmiths to examine the gun, to take it apart, to replicate it, and within a year, Japan had its first domestically crafted matchlocks. Word spread. Warlords took notice. The gun, once the foreign toy of shipwrecked traders, became an object of deadly fascination. It was no longer a matter of if the arquebus would be used, but how many and how soon. By the 1550s, firearms had become an integral part of samurai warfare. Daimyo who had the wealth to procure them in quantity found themselves able to field armies that could devastate traditional cavalry charges and shred elite warriors from a distance. No longer could a lone champion expect to carve his name into the annals of history with a sword alone. Battles became matters of formation, volley, and coordinated fire. Peasant conscripts, once the soft underbelly of any army, now became its backbone, trained to reload and shoot in rhythmic waves, forming walls of fire that defied even the most storied of swordsmen. Castles were redesigned to withstand gunfire. Armor evolved, forged thicker, and shaped differently to deflect bullets. Tactics shifted. The age of gallant duels beneath fluttering banners was slipping away. The battlefield had become a place of smoke, sound, and calculation. But with the arquebus came more than just death. Alongside the Portuguese traders arrived Jesuit missionaries, men clad in black robes who spoke of a single God, of eternal salvation, of a faith that demanded not lineage or status, but belief. They preached in markets, in castle towns, in fishing villages. Some spoke fluent Japanese within months. Others learned just enough to convert peasants and promise paradise. Their presence intrigued some and enraged others. but many daimyo saw opportunity in their arrival. Christian missionaries brought with them access to European trade networks, including a reliable flow of firearms and gunpowder. For a warlord with ambition, this was not religion, it was diplomacy. Converts were rewarded, Jesuits were protected, churches were built beside castles. Some daimyo embraced Christianity with what seemed like genuine faith. In the southern domain of Omura, in the fertile lands of Kyushu, Christian influence grew strong. In 1563, Omura Sumitada became the first Japanese lord to be baptized, taking the name Dom Bartolomeu. He welcomed missionaries, demolished Buddhist temples, and declared Christianity the official religion of his domain. In nearby Nagasaki, the Jesuits were granted the right to build churches, operate schools, and control port trade. The city became a window through which European culture, fashion, and philosophy flowed into Japan. It was here that clocks were first seen, where European art was first displayed, and where Latin hymns echoed across the stone streets of a Japanese harbor. But not all regarded these changes with such openness. Many daimyo, particularly those steeped in the traditions of Zen and Shinto, viewed the spread of Christianity with growing suspicion. The religion's insistence on exclusive worship, its rejection of ancestor veneration, and its open condemnation of Buddhism threatened the social order that had defined Japan for centuries. To some, the missionaries were no different from spies, agents of foreign kings and popes, planting seeds of revolt under the banner of heaven. To others, they were cultural vandals, seeking to erase centuries of ritual and replace them with imported absolutes. And yet, even those who hated the new faith could not ignore the weapons that accompanied it. Guns, after all, cared little for doctrine. The introduction of firearms and foreign religion had another consequence, one perhaps less visible, but no less transformative. The very idea of Japan began to shift. For centuries, Japan had regarded itself as a realm apart, a country divinely created, set apart from the wars and empires of the continent. The Mongol invasions had tested that belief, but they had also reinforced it through the miracle of the divine wind. Now, however, ships arrived that bore no armies, but could change the nation more profoundly than any invasion. Ideas entered with the gunpowder. The notion of global kingdoms, of maps that extended beyond the shores, of empires that spanned oceans and traded in silver, spices, and souls. The Sengoku warlords, who had once viewed power only through the lens of clan and province, began to see themselves as actors on a larger stage. And among those warlords, a few began to see clearly. They understood that the old ways, rooted in ritual combat, in hereditary entitlement, in reverence for broken systems, could not last. One such man, in the central province of Owari, began to rise. His name was Oda Nobunaga, and he did not see Christianity as a threat or as salvation. He saw it as a tool. He saw the arquebus not as an insult to the sword, but as its heir. He would wield both. He would not fight for Kyoto's favor or for the ghosts of Ashikaga shoguns. He would fight to end the age of division, and he would fight to win. But he had not yet come to power. For now, Japan remained a land of 100 banners, a land where guns and prayers arrived in the same ships, and where warlords ruled not by lineage, but by the strength of their walls and the steadiness of their formations. It was a time of invention and heresy, of opportunity and dread. The winds that had once kept Japan closed were now bringing fire and change. The world was knocking on the gates, and soon someone would open them. In the heart of Owari province, among the rice paddies and footpaths of a realm not yet great, a young warlord with fire in his eyes and contempt in his mouth began to pull the threads of destiny toward himself. His name was Oda Nobunaga, the second son of a minor lord with modest holdings and little reason to expect greatness. But from his earliest years, Nobunaga was not like other sons of noble houses. He defied every tradition. He scorned etiquette. He dressed in commoners' clothes, consorted with street performers, and fired his arquebus in temple courtyards. To the old men of Owari, he was a disgrace. They called him the Fool of Owari, a youth too wild to lead, too erratic to follow, too dangerous to survive. But behind his unruly demeanor and mocking laughter burned an intelligence that saw further and more clearly than any of his peers. He saw that the world around him, this world of crumbling shoguns, of feuding daimyo, of petty lords building stone castles over broken systems, was dying. And he meant to bury it himself. His path to dominance began, like so many others, in blood. When his father, Oda Nobuhide, died in 1551, Nobunaga was not yet 20 years old. His clan was divided. His retainers plotted to place his half-brother on the throne. His own mentors urged him to submit, to wait, to follow protocol. He answered with assassinations and forced suicides. One by one, the men who doubted him vanished. Those who opposed him were either destroyed or made irrelevant. By 1559, he had taken full control of the Oda clan. It was not a grand domain, not a mighty house, but it sat on a strategic throat of the Central Plains, and from it, Nobunaga would begin to choke the country into submission. Unlike other warlords, who clung to ceremony and tradition, even as they wielded fire and steel, Nobunaga had no reverence for the past. He tore it down without regret. He adopted the arquebus with enthusiasm, not as an accessory, but as the spine of his military machine. He trained his men in synchronized volleys, drilled formations until they moved as one, and redesigned his tactics not around individual valor, but collective discipline. He understood that the battlefield was no longer a place for duels and poems. It was a place for math and fire. He rewarded talent over pedigree. He welcomed merchants and craftsmen. He cared little for ancient bloodlines if a man could build walls or lead troops or supply provisions. He saw feudal Japan as a broken house and set about rebuilding it, not with reverence, but with blueprints soaked in gunpowder. In 1560, he faced his first great test. The powerful Imagawa Yoshimoto, a daimyo from the east with a force of over 20,000 men, marched westward toward Kyoto, determined to expand his power and secure the capital. Nobunaga had barely 3,000 men. His allies counseled retreat. His vassals despaired. But Nobunaga did not retreat. He studied the enemy's movements, chose his moment, and struck like a hawk. At the Battle of Okehazama, his small force launched a surprise attack during a thunderstorm, catching the Imagawa army at rest, their tents raised and their guards down. In the chaos, Nobunaga's men cut their way through to Yoshimoto himself and slew him on the field. The Imagawa army broke and scattered. Nobunaga, once a provincial upstart, had slain a giant and seized his place among the great. What followed was a campaign of relentless expansion. Nobunaga forged alliances where they were useful, broke them when they ceased to serve. He crushed rival daimyo, absorbed their lands, and tightened his grip on central Japan. He formed a critical alliance with Tokugawa Ieyasu, the cunning and calculating lord of Mikawa, whose loyalty would endure long after Nobunaga's death. He marched into Kyoto in 1568, not to pay homage, but to make a puppet of the court. He installed Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun, not to revive the Ashikaga dynasty, but to hold the sword while Nobunaga held the hilt. When Yoshiaki began to assert himself, Nobunaga turned on him as he had so many others. By 1573, he had deposed the last Ashikaga shogun and extinguished the shogunate altogether. The age of the Bakufu had ended, not with reform, but with a single man deciding it was obsolete. But military conquest was only part of his ambition. Nobunaga saw himself not merely as a warlord, but as a refounder of Japan. He encouraged commerce, lifted restrictions on markets, standardized weights and measures, and invited foreign traders to bring wealth and weapons to his ports. He welcomed Jesuit missionaries, not because he was moved by their faith, but because their presence weakened the Buddhist institutions that resisted his rule. For centuries, the great Buddhist temples had served not only as places of worship, but as political entities, wealthy and well-armed. Nobunaga regarded them as parasites. When the warrior monks of Mount Hiei resisted him, he gave the order without hesitation. In 1571, his army surrounded the mountain, set the temples alight, and massacred thousands, monks, novices, women, and children alike. The sacred slopes of Mount Hiei ran red with blood, and the flames could be seen from Kyoto. To Nobunaga, it was not sacrilege, it was strategy. He continued to reshape the land in his image. He built Azuchi Castle on the eastern shore of Lake Biwa, a marvel of stone and gilded roofs. A citadel, not only of war, but of spectacle. Its towering walls, ornate chambers, and sweeping views were symbols of his vision, that order could rise from chaos, that the future belonged not to tradition, but to mastery. He sent emissaries to Europe. He corresponded with Jesuits. He called himself the Demon King, and the name stuck because no other lord so thoroughly combined cruelty, charisma, and genius into one blade. And yet, for all his brilliance, Nobunaga did not rule with caution. He moved swiftly, trusting in momentum, certain that speed and terror would carry him through. He had made enemies in every direction. He had crushed old powers and raised new ones, and in doing so, he had surrounded himself with both admiration and hatred. His closest vassals feared him as much as they revered him. In the summer of 1582, while on campaign, he entered the temple of Honnoji in Kyoto with a small retinue. There, in the stillness of dawn, betrayal struck. One of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned on him. Whether it was vengeance, ambition, or madness is not known with certainty. But his soldiers surrounded the temple, set it alight, and stormed its halls. Nobunaga, caught without his main force, refused to be taken. He retreated into the temple, fought as long as he could, and when the end came, he took his own life, his corpse consumed by the flames. The man who had set out to unite Japan perished not in battle, but in fire and treachery. Yet his death did not undo his legacy. He had shattered the old world and revealed its bones. He had shown that power belonged to those bold enough to seize it and brutal enough to keep it. And though he never saw the country united, he had carved the road that others would follow. His banner had fallen, but the march toward unification had begun, and it would not be halted. The death of Oda Nobunaga in the smoke and blood of Honnoji might have ended a lesser man's ambition. The shattering of such a towering figure, slain not by an enemy in battle but by one of his own commanders in an act of betrayal, left a power vacuum vast enough to engulf the realm once more. Many believed the unification he had worked toward with fire and iron would dissolve into another century of war. But among the scattered pieces of Nobunaga's empire, one man rose with startling speed and clarity of purpose. A man born of no noble blood, a man who had once served as a sandal-bearer, a man whose rise had defied every law of birth and station. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and in the furnace of Nobunaga's death, he forged the final phase of the Sengoku age. Hideyoshi had been one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, a man of small stature but immense cunning, unrelenting energy, and uncanny charisma. Where others hesitated in the aftermath of the assassination, he moved with blinding speed. Upon hearing of Nobunaga's death, he made peace with the Mori clan, whom he had been besieging in the west, and turned his forces toward the traitor. In less than 2 weeks, he cornered Akechi Mitsuhide at Yamazaki and annihilated his forces in a crushing victory. Mitsuhide was killed while fleeing. His body, like his ambitions, disappeared without ceremony. In that single decisive act, Hideyoshi avenged his fallen lord and seized control of the narrative. He became not merely Nobunaga's successor, but his avenger and heir. The road from general to ruler was not simple. Many of Nobunaga's remaining retainers were powerful men, bound by loyalty to the Oda name and ambitious in their own right. But Hideyoshi proved himself a master of diplomacy as well as war. He married into noble families, showered allies with rewards, and disarmed rivals with honeyed words before he ever raised a sword. When resistance came, as it did in the form of Shibata Katsui and later Tokugawa Ieyasu, he answered swiftly. The Battle of Shizugatake in 1583 secured his dominance over the north. In 1584, when conflict with Tokugawa threatened to erupt into full war, Hideyoshi negotiated peace, marrying his sister to Ieyasu and postponing a confrontation that would wait for another generation. By 1585, he was granted the court title of Kampaku, Imperial Regent, and though he had no blood claim to the title, he wore it as a badge of triumph. The emperor himself, long sidelined and ceremonial, gave his blessing. By 1590, with the fall of the last independent daimyo, the Hojo clan at Odawara, Hideyoshi completed the task that had eluded Nobunaga. For the first time in over 100 years, all of Japan was under one rule. And yet, Hideyoshi was not a shogun. His peasant birth barred him from the title. The shogunate had always belonged to the samurai class, and though Hideyoshi commanded more power than any shogun before him, he did not dare claim the office. Instead, he operated through court titles and bureaucratic appointments, creating a structure of governance that centered entirely around himself. His palace at Jurakudai in Kyoto became a court of opulence and precision, where gold leaf-covered walls and poetry contests were held beneath chandeliers of iron and silk. Diplomats and daimyo from across the country came to pay homage, and his court became the axis of political life. Yet, beneath the elegance lay an iron will. Hideyoshi had risen from the lowest rung of society and understood better than any man alive the fragility of order. He knew that without reform, Japan would slip back into the abyss it had just emerged from. To preserve unity, he undertook sweeping changes. He ordered the Great Sword Hunt of 1588, in which all weapons were confiscated from peasants and non-samurai. under the guise of peace and religious piety. The tools were melted down and reforged into a great statue of the Buddha, a gesture that cloaked pragmatic control in religious symbolism. The real goal was clear: to ensure that only the samurai held arms, to draw a permanent line between warriors and commoners. He reinforced a rigid social order, freezing mobility between classes and codifying the hierarchy of lords, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Domains were carefully measured, lands were surveyed, and tax systems standardized. By centralizing authority and reducing the autonomy of regional lords, Hideyoshi created a delicate web of control, one that stretched from the imperial palace to the most remote provinces. Yet power did not tame his ambition. As Japan settled into peace under his hand, Hideyoshi's thoughts turned outward. The islands were unified, the daimyo were pacified, the fields were planted, and the temples rebuilt. But Hideyoshi, once a foot soldier and now the master of the realm, wanted more. He looked across the sea to Korea and China and imagined an empire of his own. In 1592, he launched the first of 2 invasions of the Korean peninsula, declaring his intent to march through Joseon Korea and conquer Ming China. The campaign, though initially successful, soon collapsed under the weight of overextension, fierce Korean resistance, and the intervention of Chinese forces. The war dragged on, draining coffers and costing tens of thousands of lives. A second invasion in 1597 fared no better. It ended only with Hideyoshi's death in 1598, and with it, Japan's brief, bloody flirtation with continental conquest came to an end. As he lay dying, Hideyoshi could not rest. His only son, Hideyori, was a child. Knowing the chaos that might follow his passing, Hideyoshi established a council of 5 elders, Japan's most powerful lords, to serve as regents and protectors of his son's claim. Among them was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the cunning ally turned quiet rival. Hideyoshi's final act was not one of victory, but of fear. Fear that the unity he had forged would dissolve without his hand upon the reins. And in that, he was not wrong. Hideyoshi had risen from nothing. He had ruled everything. He had transformed the nature of leadership in Japan, proving that genius and ambition could elevate a man above the constraints of blood. His governance laid the foundations for the peace that would follow. His edicts would endure for centuries. And yet, his legacy was unfinished. The boy he left behind would not hold the nation. The council he trusted would fracture, and the man who had waited silently through it all would soon rise, not to serve the Toyotomi name, but to bury it. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi's body was laid to rest in the autumn of 1598, the air over Japan thickened not with mourning, but with tension. The great unifier had died with his work unfinished. Though he had subdued the daimyo and ruled the realm with unmatched authority, he had left no stable path forward. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was but 5 years old, too young to lead, too important to ignore. In the final months of his life, Hideyoshi had tried to safeguard his legacy with the formation of a council of 5 elders, each a powerful warlord entrusted with stewardship of the land until the child came of age. But peace forged by fear is fragile, and men who had bent the knee to Hideyoshi did so only because his shadow loomed long and dark. With his death, the sun touched the ground once more, and the ambitions of old men stirred like roots breaking through stone. At the heart of the council stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the lord of Mikawa and later of the vast Kanto region, a man who had spent decades maneuvering through chaos. He was patient, deliberate, and unflinchingly calculating. While others chased glory with blades drawn and voices raised, Ieyasu watched, listened, and waited. He had survived Oda Nobunaga, outlived Hideyoshi, and now stood as the most powerful of the surviving lords. He had served faithfully under both men, feigning humility where necessary and loyalty where useful. But with Hideyoshi dead and the regency fractured, Ieyasu saw that the hour he had waited for his entire life had finally arrived. The years that followed Hideyoshi's death were marked by a slow unraveling of the fragile balance. Factions began to form beneath the surface of ceremony. On one side stood Ieyasu and his supporters, powerful lords who favored a firm hand and a centralized order, most of whom had little loyalty to the Toyotomi child. On the other stood those who remained loyal to the memory of Hideyoshi, or at least feared what Ieyasu's dominance might mean. At the head of this opposition rose Ishida Mitsunari, a court bureaucrat elevated under Hideyoshi's rule. Ishida had never been a general of note, but he wielded influence in Kyoto and had the ear of many who still revered the Toyotomi name. He accused Ieyasu of violating the oaths sworn to the regency, of accumulating power for himself, of preparing to usurp the child lord. Ieyasu, for his part, did not deny it. He simply moved his pieces into position. By 1600, the country stood on the edge of civil war once more. Alliances were made, then broken. Messages were carried by torch and whisper. Samurai sharpened their swords. Provinces chose sides. When the storm finally broke, it did so not in the shadowed halls of Kyoto or the gardens of Osaka Castle, but on the misty fields of Sekigahara, a narrow mountain pass in the central provinces, where the fate of Japan would be decided in a single thunderous clash. On the morning of October 21st, 1600, Ieyasu's eastern army faced Ishida's western army across the fog-laced plain. Ieyasu commanded roughly 75,000 troops, a formidable force drawn from loyal vassals, eastern domains, and opportunistic allies. Ishida had a similar number. 80,000 men gathered from western provinces, Toyotomi loyalists, and clans who feared Tokugawa's rise. The armies arrayed themselves across the fields, hills, and wooded ridges, their banners snapping in the cold air, their commanders scanning the terrain not just for tactical advantage, but for signs of betrayal. For betrayal was inevitable. Sekigahara was not a battle won by strength alone. It was won with letters, bribes, and promises. For weeks before the engagement, Ieyasu had courted potential turncoats in Ishida's camp, offering land, gold, and clemency. Among those courted was Kobayakawa Hideaki, a young and uncertain general who had once fought under Hideyoshi, but now hesitated in Ishida's ranks. His men stood atop a hill to the south, a dagger poised above Tokugawa's flank, or shield, depending on which way the wind turned. The battle began in earnest as the fog lifted. Ishida's forces surged forward, and for a time, the outcome remained uncertain. Arrows rained, cannons thundered, samurai clashed in waves of steel and cries. Blood soaked the earth. But Ieyasu had not come to fight a fair war. He had come to finish one. At a crucial moment, he ordered his men to fire upon Kobayakawa's position, not to destroy them, but to force their hand. Under pressure, the young general at last moved. not against Ieyasu, but against Ishida. His troops descended upon their supposed allies, shattering the Western army's flank. The betrayal broke the morale of Ishida's forces, and what followed was a rout. Ishida fled, but was soon captured. He was taken to Kyoto and beheaded. Other commanders were hunted down or surrendered. Their domains were stripped, their families scattered, their names erased. Sekigahara ended not just a battle, but an age. It marked the final collapse of Toyotomi authority and the end of any meaningful resistance to Tokugawa rule. Ieyasu, now the undisputed master of Japan, did not immediately crown himself. He returned to Edo, his stronghold in the east, and waited. He consolidated his gains, rewarded his allies, punished his enemies, and rebuilt the web of authority on terms he alone dictated. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor named him Sei Taishogun. The title had once been ceremonial. In Ieyasu's hands, it became absolute. Thus began the Tokugawa shogunate, the final and most enduring military government in Japanese history. The long chaos of the Sengoku period was over. The land, at last, was still. With the Battle of Sekigahara behind him and the Toyotomi loyalists scattered or dead, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood not just as a victor, but as the architect of a new age. The blood of tens of thousands had soaked into the soil of the central provinces, and the cries of the defeated still echoed in the hills. But from that ruin, Ieyasu began to lay the foundations of a peace unlike anything Japan had known. He was a patient man, cautious where Nobunaga had been wild, deliberate where Hideyoshi had been bold. He did not rush to seize power outright. Instead, he moved with the slow, unshakable purpose of a glacier grinding across stone. He took the measure of every province, every clan, every rival still drawing breath, and only when all threads were in his hand did he make his move. In the spring of 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu accepted from the emperor the ancient title of Sei Taishogun, a name first carved into the bones of the early Kamakura warlords. But where earlier shogunates had governed by strength and collapsed under factional strife or imperial interference, Ieyasu crafted something harder, colder, and far more enduring. He established his capital not in Kyoto, which had become a place of shadows and memories, nor in Osaka, where the Toyotomi child still lived behind stone walls, but in Edo, a marshland castle town in the east that he transformed into the beating heart of his new realm. From that place, far from the old courtly factions and monastic conspiracies, he built a machinery of governance designed not merely to rule, but to last. The Tokugawa order was not forged through spectacle or cult of personality. It was constructed like a fortress, stone by stone, law by law. Ieyasu understood the fragility of peace in a land soaked in civil war, and so he designed a system to hold Japan together by tension rather than trust. He did not abolish the daimyo, but he bound them with silk and iron. Every lord was allowed to keep his domain, but only under the eye of the shogunate. To control them, he imposed the Sankin Kotai system, the alternate attendance policy that forced each daimyo to spend half the year in Edo and leave his family there as hostages. It was a masterstroke. No castle could be razed, no rebellion planned, without the shogun knowing. The lords, drained by the cost of travel and maintaining dual households, had little energy left for revolt. Their pride remained intact, but their autonomy had been quietly shackled. It was not a rule enforced by open violence, but by slow, calculated exhaustion. They obeyed because defiance became impossible. Social order was similarly calcified. Under Tokugawa rule, the rigid four-tier class system became law. At the top stood the samurai, now transformed from war-hardened horsemen into bureaucrats and administrators. Below them stood the farmers, who produced the rice that fed the system. Then came the artisans, who shaped the tools and goods of daily life. At the bottom were the merchants, once seen as parasites, and now quietly growing in influence as the gears of commerce turned behind closed doors. Movement between classes was frozen. A man was born into his station and would die in it. The chaos of the Sengoku age had offered mobility through war. The Tokugawa age offered peace through stasis. The emperor, still robed in sacred antiquity, remained in Kyoto, revered but powerless. Ieyasu did not abolish the court, for he knew that legitimacy flowed from tradition as surely as power flowed from arms. He allowed the rituals to continue, the poetry to be written, the ancient dances to unfold in the palace halls, but they were now part of a pageant, a careful display of continuity that masked the fact that true authority had long since migrated east. Edo pulsed with roads, canals, granaries, and laws. It was there that edicts were issued. It was there that power resided. Religion, too, was brought to heel. Ieyasu viewed Christianity with suspicion and moved swiftly to restrict its spread. Though Hideyoshi had already begun the persecution of Christians in the late 16th century, it was under Tokugawa rule that the suppression became systematic. Foreign missionaries were expelled. Japanese Christians were forced to renounce their faith or face death. Temples and shrines were brought into the fold of state control. Buddhism was institutionalized, its temples made responsible for registering citizens and monitoring heresy. It was not piety that motivated these reforms, but order. Faiths that demanded allegiance to powers beyond the shogun could not be tolerated. The sword of Tokugawa did not permit divided loyalty. Yet for all its restraints, the early Tokugawa age was not one of bleak oppression. It was a time of restoration, of reconstruction. The land, so long ravaged by war, was allowed to breathe. Fields were planted and harvested without the fear of fire. Roads were made safe for travel. Markets reopened. Towns flourished. The arts returned. Kabuki theatres, woodblock printing, and haiku poetry blossomed. Peace brought prosperity, and prosperity brought culture. The samurai, once warriors, now turned their minds to philosophy and governance. A new generation grew up without ever knowing the clang of battle. It was, in every sense, a new Japan. Ieyasu himself did not live to see the full shape of what he had built. He formally retired in 1605, passing the title of shogun to his son Hidetada, though he remained the true power behind the curtain until his death in 1616. Even in death, he ensured his permanence. His body was enshrined at Nikko, where he was deified as Tosho Daigongen, the great incarnate deity of the East. The shrine became a symbol of Tokugawa might, elaborate, eternal, and silent beneath the cedar trees. He had begun life as a hostage, survived under Oda and Hideyoshi, and lived long enough to rule them all. He had outweighted them, outlasted them, and remade the country in his own vision. The age of warlords had ended. The sword had been sheathed, though never discarded, and over the land, for the first time in centuries, there came a stillness, not born of exhaustion, but of design. The Tokugawa peace had begun, and it would endure not for a generation, but for more than 2 centuries. The wheel of war had stopped turning, and the people of Japan, for the first time in living memory, could look to the future without the fear of fire. The first decades of the Tokugawa peace settled over Japan like snow upon scorched earth. The fury and tumult of the Sengoku age, once so constant and thunderous, became distant memory, spoken of in poems and recounted by grey-haired veterans who no longer carried swords for battle, but for ceremony. In place of fire and conquest, there came silence, order, and a carefully tended system of balance that reached into every province, every village, every household. The new age did not arrive through revolution, but through stillness, enforced by meticulous design. The Edo period was not only a time without war, it was a time in which war itself became unthinkable. Tokugawa Ieyasu had constructed the frame of the new state, but it was his successors who filled in its details and fortified it against the winds of change. Hidetada, and more notably his son Iemitsu, governed not as warlords, but as architects of a closed realm. Their rule was one of control not only over land and armies, but over thought, over movement, over the invisible threads that tied one man to another. The shogunate became not simply a military government, but a shadow court that loomed above the emperor, the daimyo, and the people, shaping their lives without ever needing to shout. Its silence was its strength. One of the defining features of this age was sakoku, the policy of national isolation. Though not absolute in the way the term is often misunderstood, the spirit of the policy was clear. Beginning in the 1630s under Iemitsu's reign, foreign trade and contact were tightly restricted. Portuguese missionaries, whose religion had once flowed into the country with gunpowder and silver, were expelled. Christianity, seen as a subversive threat to the shogunate's order, was suppressed with a ferocity that left its traces in mass executions, forced apostasy, and hidden communities who prayed in secret to avoid the sword. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, led by desperate peasants and disaffected Christian samurai, confirmed the fears of the Tokugawa elite. Though it was crushed with ruthless efficiency, the insurrection became the final justification for sealing the country off from the unpredictable tides of the outside world. Foreign merchants were not entirely banished. The Dutch, pragmatic and uninterested in missionary work, were permitted to trade from the man-made island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay under close surveillance and with strict limitations. Through them, knowledge of European science, medicine, and astronomy entered Japan in trickles. This rangaku, or Dutch learning, would one day bloom into an intellectual curiosity that challenged the old order. But in these early years, it remained a whisper beneath the walls. The Chinese, too, continued limited trade, and envoys from Korea maintained ceremonial ties. But these contacts were framed as carefully curated spectacles, rituals that reinforced Japan's sense of self-sufficiency. The nation turned inward, not with fear, but with conviction. To the Tokugawa rulers, peace was not merely the absence of war. It was the enforcement of harmony, the elimination of chaos, the precise balance of power where no blade need ever be drawn again. Within the borders, the daimyo remained powerful in name, but their every move was watched. The alternate attendance system, Sankin Kotai, had by now evolved into a mechanism of both loyalty and bankruptcy. Lords traveled with enormous retinues, parading their wealth through the highways of the shogunate, but the cost of such displays drained their coffers and bound them ever more tightly to Edo. Their families, held in the capital, were hostages in all but name. Roads were improved to facilitate this travel. Milestones and checkpoints were established. Commoners required permits to journey beyond their provinces. Everything moved with permission. Nothing moved freely. Samurai, too, found themselves transformed. No longer warriors in the field, they became administrators, scribes, and magistrates. Their swords remained, but their days were filled with scrolls and judgments, rather than duels and marches. Some resented this transition, clinging to stories of their ancestors' glories. Others embraced the new life, studying Confucian classics, engaging in philosophical debates, and becoming stewards of law and custom. Beneath them, the peasantry toiled in the fields, bound by duty and tax. Above them, merchants grew in wealth and subtle power, supplying the towns and cities with goods and luxuries, even as official doctrine dismissed them as the lowest class. A quiet contradiction began to take shape. The samurai held status, but the merchants held coin. The cities of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto flourished. Edo in particular became a sprawling metropolis, its population swelling with samurai retainers, artisans, laborers, and merchants. The town that had once been a muddy outpost became the beating heart of the shogunate, its streets lined with shops and tea houses, its waters crossed by bridges, its air alive with gossip and song. The Genroku era, beginning in the late 17th century, marked a cultural flowering. Kabuki theatre evolved from outlawed street performances into a vibrant art form, with actors attaining fame and patrons. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, captured the faces of courtesans, landscapes, and moments of fleeting beauty. Poets like Matsuo Basho wandered the countryside, composing haiku that distilled entire landscapes into 17 syllables. It was an age of paradox. Violence had been suppressed, yet authority rested on the memory of violence. Freedom was curtailed, yet art and literature thrived. The shogunate promised order and delivered it, but only through layers of compulsion, surveillance, and ritualized submission. There were no grand wars, no sweeping revolts, only occasional flickers of dissent, easily extinguished. And beneath it all, time moved like a slow river, wearing down the will of those who still remembered the days of ambition and blood. For over a century, the system held. Children were born who had never seen war. Farmers passed their land to sons without fear of bandits or armies. Samurai passed their duties to sons who had never seen a battlefield. The Tokugawa peace was not golden, but it was enduring. And as the years turned to decades, and the decades to centuries, the great machine ground forward, self-contained and certain of its place in the world. The Tokugawa peace endured, but like all great fortresses built of stone and silence, it bore the seeds of its own erosion. What had once been a sanctuary from war slowly became a cage of immobility, a delicate balance dependent on the obedience of millions and the unchallenged supremacy of a single dynasty. Beneath the quiet order, fractures spread like roots in dry earth. The rituals of authority endured, the banners of the shogunate flew above well-guarded castles, and the roads remained safe for travelers. But inside the walls, rot began to bloom, not from fire or steel, but from hunger, misrule, and the slow betrayal of purpose. By the 18th century, the Tokugawa machine had become heavy with its own weight. The bureaucracy that had once ensured order now often produced paralysis. Petty officials, bound to precedents and crippled by hierarchy, made decisions not to improve the lives of the people, but to preserve the illusion of control. Corruption, once punished with the sword, was now tolerated in exchange for loyalty and silence. The daimyo, forced to maintain extravagant appearances and make costly pilgrimages to Edo each year, grew weaker in both purse and spirit. Their ability to govern with independent authority atrophied, and in many domains, local administrators ruled in their stead, some with competence, others with cruelty. The samurai class, once revered as the sword and soul of the nation, found itself increasingly irrelevant. Their ability to govern with independent authority atrophied, and in many domains, local administrators ruled in their stead, some with competence, others with cruelty. The samurai class, once revered as the sword and soul of the nation, found itself increasingly irrelevant. But it was not corruption alone that weakened the bones of the Tokugawa state. Nature, too, turned against it. The 18th and early 19th centuries brought a series of devastating famines, the most catastrophic of which struck in the 1780s. The Tenmei famine, brought on by volcanic eruptions, floods, and failed harvests, swept through the countryside like a slow-moving plague. Crops withered in the fields. Rice prices soared. Peasants sold their children to survive. In some provinces, they sold their own flesh. Desperation turned to rage, and in town after town, uprisings broke out. Storehouses were raided. Merchant homes were looted. Samurai were stoned in the streets. Though most of these revolts were small and swiftly suppressed, they revealed a truth long ignored by the ruling class, that the carefully constructed hierarchy was sustained not by divine mandate or cultural harmony, but by the capacity of the people to endure suffering without revolt. When that endurance failed, so too did the illusion. In the cities, the merchant class continued to thrive, defying the social order through sheer necessity. Though officially placed at the bottom of the Confucian hierarchy, they had become the economic lifeblood of the nation. They financed the rice brokers, managed shipping networks, and quietly accumulated vast wealth. Samurai indebted to them bristled with resentment, but had little recourse. The sword no longer trumped the coin. Artisans and tradesmen followed suit, forming guilds and communities of staggering complexity. The economy flourished in ways the government could neither predict nor control. And yet, even as towns bustled and new forms of art emerged from the urban pleasure quarters, the shogunate looked inward, backward, clinging to old codes and punishing those who questioned the system. Intellectual dissent began to stir. Scholars of Kokugaku, or national learning, challenged the supremacy of Chinese Confucian ideals and urged a return to the supposed purity of ancient Japanese tradition, elevating the emperor's divine ancestry and Shinto beliefs over foreign imports. Others studied Dutch medicine and science in secret, seeking to understand a world that Japan had long kept at bay. These scholars, though few in number, planted seeds of thought that would one day crack the walls of isolation from within. Knowledge became a quiet rebellion, passed in manuscripts, spoken in whispers, growing year by year beneath the veneer of stillness. Even within the shogunate, there were those who understood that the world was changing. Some officials attempted reforms. The most notable among them was Matsudaira Sadanobu, who enacted the Kansei reforms in the late 18th century. Measures meant to restore frugality, strengthen moral governance, and correct the economic imbalances that had plagued the realm. His policies brought temporary relief, but could not reverse the tide. They were salves, not cures. The shogunate had been designed to endure the swords of rebels, but not the weight of stagnation and the hunger of the masses. Meanwhile, on the shores of distant continents, great storms were brewing. Western powers, armed with gunpowder, steel hulls, and imperial ambition, were carving the world into colonies. Spain had claimed the Americas. Britain had reached India and China. The Dutch and French expanded their empires across Asia. While Japan remained closed, the world around it had been transformed. Steamships crossed oceans in weeks, not months. Cannons were mounted on iron hulls. Telegraphs carried messages faster than a man could ride. And all the while, the island nation clung to its rituals, its censored maps, and its belief in self-sufficiency. The Tokugawa shogunate had created a society that could endure famine, silence dissent, and suppress revolt. But it could not stop time. It could not stop the hunger of the poor, the curiosity of the scholar, the ambition of the merchant, or the inevitable knock upon its door. Though the gates of Japan had been closed to the world for over 2 centuries, the footsteps of change were drawing closer. They could already be heard across the sea, boots on the deck of a foreign ship, voices speaking a language no magistrate could silence, sails rising on the eastern horizon like dark wings ready to land. The walls of Edo still stood, the flag still flew, but the cracks were growing and the storm was coming. The storm came not with armies, but with smoke, steam, and iron. On a summer morning in 1853, the waters of Edo Bay shivered beneath the hulls of 4 black ships, war steamers of the United States Navy, looming like beasts from some foreign legend, belching coal smoke and bearing guns whose thunder could tear castles apart from leagues away. At their helm stood Commodore Matthew Perry, a man sent not to conquer Japan, but to open it. The mission was couched in the language of diplomacy, but there was no mistaking the threat that hung from every cannon. His arrival marked the beginning of the end for the old world. The samurai, once lords of all they surveyed, now stood gazing out to sea at a power they could neither match nor fully understand. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled Japan behind closed gates. Foreign contact had been minimal, carefully monitored, and allowed only through narrow channels in Nagasaki. But the age of isolation had made Japan vulnerable in ways the shogunate had never anticipated. While they preserved ancient hierarchies and polished the veneer of peace, the Western world had reshaped itself through industrial revolutions, scientific discovery, and mechanized war. To the Americans, Japan was not just a mystery, it was a port that could refuel their whaling ships, a market yet untapped, and a piece on the imperial chessboard of Asia. Perry did not ask. He presented a letter from President Fillmore and declared his intention to return the following year for an answer. Then, with theatrical precision, he turned his ships and steamed away, leaving behind confusion, fear, and the terrible weight of inevitability. The return came in 1854, and this time Perry brought more ships, more guns, and an unspoken ultimatum. The shogunate, fractured by internal debates and paralyzed by the weight of centuries-old custom, capitulated. In the spring, they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. It opened 2 ports to American ships, allowed for a US consul in Japan, and began the slow erosion of the Sakoku policy that had shielded the archipelago for generations. Other Western nations followed quickly, extracting treaties of their own, often under the threat of naval bombardment. These treaties, known collectively as the Unequal Treaties, gave foreign powers economic and legal privileges not granted to Japanese citizens. Extraterritoriality, low tariffs, and consular courts became new wounds upon the nation's sovereignty. As foreign influence spread, so too did dissent. Samurai, who had grown soft in the peace of Edo, suddenly found themselves in a world where their swords were useless against rifles and diplomacy. Among them arose two competing factions: those who believed the shogunate could adapt, modernize, and survive, and those who believed it must be destroyed. The rallying cry of Sonojoi, "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians," gained power among the disaffected. Domains in the south, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, became hotbeds of radical thought. They armed themselves with Western weapons, trained with modern tactics, and began to dream of revolution, not to restore the past, but to forge something new in the emperor's name. Meanwhile, the shogunate, weakened by indecision and internal strife, stumbled. It sent envoys abroad. It built Western-style ships. It tried to reform. But each step forward was hampered by the weight of its own bureaucracy and the distrust of its own people. In 1867, the final shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, stood atop the crumbling edifice of Tokugawa authority and saw what was coming. He abdicated, returning power, at least in name, to the emperor in Kyoto. But the gesture was too late. The momentum had shifted. In 1868, the Boshin War erupted, a brief but bloody civil conflict between the forces loyal to the Tokugawa and those determined to restore imperial rule. The old capital of Edo was captured and renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital, a symbol of rebirth. By the spring of 1869, the war was over. The Tokugawa were defeated. The emperor, still a teenager and more symbol than sovereign, was now the focus of national unity. The Meiji Restoration had begun, not merely a change in ruler, but a transformation of the entire nation. The samurai class, once the bedrock of Japanese society, found itself obsolete almost overnight. Their stipends were abolished. Their swords were banned in public. Their privileges disappeared. Some adapted. Many fell into poverty. A few, clinging to the honor of a bygone age, rose in rebellion. But the age of steel and gunpowder had passed them by. The black ships had not simply arrived. They had shattered the spell of stasis that the Tokugawa had cast over Japan for more than 2 centuries. What followed would be an era of frenetic change, modernization, and reinvention. But the old world, the world of feudal lords, sacred swords, and silent streets under the rule of the shogunate, had reached its final chapter. The samurai, once feared and revered, now stepped into the realm of myth, their tales carried not in the clatter of hooves on battlefield mud, but in the quiet pages of history. The final days of the samurai did not end with a thunderclap, but with a quiet, inexorable fading. In the years that followed the Meiji Restoration, the sword that had once ruled Japan was laid down not with ceremony, but with resignation. The new government, determined to modernize with unmatched speed, abolished the privileges of the warrior class with brutal efficiency. Their hereditary stipends were replaced with government bonds that quickly lost value. Their right to carry swords, once the defining mark of their station, was revoked by decree. They were told to wear Western suits instead of lacquered armor. They were told to become bureaucrats, soldiers, teachers, or merchants. Some obeyed. Others drifted into ruin. A few chose to die rather than live without the code that had defined their bloodlines for centuries. But even as their worldly power disappeared, the idea of the samurai refused to die. It clung to the bones of the country like fog in a mountain valley, persistent and elusive. In villages and cities, in the memories of grandparents and the songs of traveling performers, the samurai lived on. Their battles, victories, and betrayals became legend. Their names were whispered in classrooms, engraved in family shrines, painted on woodblock prints, sold in marketplaces where their descendants now sold vegetables or silk. The Meiji state, though desperate to modernize, understood the usefulness of myth. It did not erase the samurai from memory. Instead, it folded their legacy into the new national identity, transforming warriors into symbols of discipline, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. The sword, once outlawed, became ceremonial. The Bushido Code, once a complex and evolving set of values, was romanticized into a singular ideal: stoic, loyal, unyielding. In truth, the samurai had never been a monolith. They were not all noble. They were not always honorable. They fought civil wars. They murdered rivals. They burned temples and razed villages. Their history was stained with as much blood as glory. But in the ruins of the past, people do not remember contradictions. They remember the stories. The lone warrior facing 100 foes, the retainer who chose death over disloyalty, the general who gave his lands to save his people. These were the tales that endured. The new imperial army, built in the image of European powers, adopted samurai imagery to instill pride and discipline. The martial spirit of Bushido was invoked to strengthen morale and justify sacrifice. In schools, students memorized the names of great warriors and were taught to emulate their virtues. But in doing so, the spirit of the samurai was reshaped. No longer a class, but a national myth. No longer a caste of swordsmen, but an idea woven into the soul of modern Japan. Even the rebellions of the last samurai, men like Saigo Takamori, who led a doomed revolt against the Meiji government in 1877, were folded into this mythology. Saigo, who died by seppuku after his forces were crushed, was later rehabilitated, his image polished into that of a tragic hero who had died for principle. Statues were raised in his honor. His tale became the cornerstone of countless novels, films, and plays. In death, he achieved what he could not in life: a place in the eternal pantheon of samurai lore. As the 20th century dawned, Japan emerged as a modern nation. Trains replaced horses. Gunpowder replaced the bow. The emperor, once veiled behind court protocol, now stood as a modern sovereign presiding over an industrial empire. But beneath the rails and factories, beneath the suits and uniforms, the ghost of feudal Japan lingered. In the precision of martial arts, in the silence of the tea ceremony, in the brushstrokes of calligraphy, the old world still breathed. And when Japan went to war in the modern age, it was the samurai spirit that generals invoked. Whether they understood its complexities or not, they carried its banner into battle. In time, the world changed again. War came and went. Empires rose and crumbled. Japan fell and rebuilt itself. The samurai did not return, but neither were they forgotten. Today, their armor rests behind glass. Their swords lie in museums, sharp but silent. Their names are spoken not in fear, but with reverence. Their castles are ruins, their banners faded, yet their spirit, ever mutable, still walks the land. The samurai were born in blood, ruled through fear, and died in silence. But their story is eternal. It lies not only in what they did, but in what they became, the embodiment of a nation's memory, a memory of loyalty in the face of treachery, of duty above self, of honor carried like a sword across generations. They are gone, but their legacy, shaped by centuries of war, peace, and myth, endures. And in that legacy, the heart of feudal Japan still beats.